So I wanted to make a video on monism and dualism, but in particular, monism, because I see a lot of people, especially online, interested in philosophy, tend to adopt a monistic metaphysic, which, to be fair, is kind of understandable because monism, it seems to explain a lot of things on its face. You could kind of understand why somebody would be a monist because it is kind of hard to not see reality as a unified ontology. What else could it be besides a unified ontology? It doesn't. There tends to be a lot of metaphysical and logical issues if you don't accept that premise. Now, however, I think that just because you believe being or reality is unified, it doesn't necessarily make you a monist. Now, before I define monism, I want to emphasize here that not all monism, or rather, there are very different forms of monism that appear in all different kinds of philosophical or even religious traditions. However, they all have one thing in common, and that's the belief that distinction is fundamentally not a fundamental or real ontology. So I do want to define monism. I'm also going to define dualism, and today I'm going to give you two arguments against monism because I do think it is a deeply flawed metaphysical position. I'm going to give you two arguments against that, and I'm going to give you one argument against dualism. So, and feel free, please, to critique these arguments. If you think there's something wrong with them, be my guest to give me your feedback. I don't think I've created these arguments. I don't think they're necessarily unique to me. I have been influenced by some other people in the creation of these arguments. In regards to monism, Greg Bonson, who is a Christian apologist, tends to argue, he has some arguments against the Far Eastern religions, and he uses something very similar to the first argument that I'm about to make to argue against these Far Eastern religions. Now, the second argument, I kind of came to this conclusion on my own, just kind of thinking about being and what being is, what's necessary about being, what is not necessary about being. Now, I don't know if anyone else has come to this conclusion. I'm sure they have. I don't really think that, especially in the time we live, that there are any more really unique philosophical discoveries. So I'm sure someone else has thought of this before. Maybe they haven't even written about it, but I'm sure someone else has thought of this. With that said, we're going to start with defining monism and dualism, which I do think is very important because the last time I did a video like this on why I thought simulation theory was false, people kind of took an issue with that because they said I didn't define, or I was conflating the notion that the world is an illusion with the notion that the world is a simulation. I do think that they overlap. I basically think they're the same, but people kind of didn't like that, and fair enough. I'm going to be more rigorous in this video, and I'm going to try and do the best I can to define the terms before critiquing them. So, monism. Monism is going to be defined as a metaphysical claim that all of reality or being is fundamentally more one than it is many, and that apparent distinction is illusory and not fundamental. Now, it should be noted that all monists believe that reality is unified, but not all of those who believe reality is unified are monists, as they can still affirm the actuality of distinction and yet accept the unification of all these distinct objects. Dualism is a metaphysical claim that being is fundamentally divided into two distinct ontologies. These ontologies obviously can vary, and that these two are typically symbiotic in terms of logical necessity or metaphysical relation. So they believe that both these distinct ontologies are metaphysically fundamental to the same degree. Now, I will provide two arguments against monism, one being an epistemological critique, the other being more so a direct metaphysical one. However, it should be stressed that both epistemology and metaphysics are interrelated, as when you make a metaphysical claim, it presupposes that you have some way of knowing this, and knowing is proper to epistemology. Now, on the flip side of this, making an epistemological claim presupposes that we can know things and that knowledge is attainable, which is presupposing the metaphysical claim that being is intelligible or structured in a manner in which we can know. But when I say which we can know, I mean that being or reality exists in a way that we can reason about and make truth claims about. So that's how metaphysics affects epistemology. But we often hear how our epistemology is going to affect our metaphysical outlook. But yeah, so they're both related. Now, and this is important because this is you have to understand this for the next two arguments, really. To give an example, let's say I make the claim that only particular ontologies exist, so no universals. Well, then this assumes that I can only know particulars as they are all that exists, and so the former claim, which is a metaphysical, the claim that only particulars exist, affects my latter claim, which is epistemological, which is me saying that I can only know particulars. So the metaphysical claim is only particulars exist. The epistemological claim would be I can only know particulars. So we can reverse this as well by saying that if I adopt a certain epistemology, like let's say empiricism, then it would follow that I can only say particulars exist because my epistemology, aka my theory of knowledge, does not allow me to make any other metaphysical claims. So you'll see once again why this is important. So these arguments are kind of lengthy. I can put them in the description, but so you can go back and read them yourselves. But the first argument against monism is this: 1. If we assume the monist position to be the case, we must affirm that all distinction is illusory, which is to say that it is not real as it is manifested to us, which is also to say that it exists as an illusion and nothing more. 2. If distinction is an illusion, distinction has no real basis in being apart from its existence as an illusion, i.e. a false perception. 3. Therefore, if distinction is an illusion, it is a false perception. 4. False perceptions, by nature of them being false, cannot lead us to the truth, whether or not these perceptions are ones of a priori reason or sense data. A priori reason is another way of saying reason itself, and sense data is just a way of saying it through observation. 5. All arguments presuppose distinction, whether it be internal, for example, premises are distinct as well as the conclusions they come to are distinct from the premises, or external, for example, that one argument is not the same as another, as well as that an argument's opposite is not the same as the argument, as there would be no difference between the contradicting theses. 6. Therefore, if monism is true, there cannot be an argument for monism, as firstly, one cannot say that the premises and conclusions of an argument for monism are true, as one cannot make the argument to begin with. Therefore, there's no reason to accept the position if you can't make an argument for it. As if there is no difference between premise and conclusion, then it is circular and invalid. So, if there's no distinction between the premises, which there can't be in a monistic system, then we can't accept the premises and conclusions, because if they're just repeating, then they're not telling us anything. They're just saying the same thing, and they can't even really exist because there would be no premises and conclusions, because or there could be no premises either, because premises, plural, presupposes more than one, which is distinction once again. Now, secondly, if monism is true and distinction does not exist, then there's no difference between an argument for monism and an argument against monism. So once again, because there's no distinction, you can't have any contradiction is not real, so it's not going to work. So 7, and the reason contradiction is not real because contradiction presupposes distinction. 7, monism cannot be argued for logically because it does not allow for logic to even exist, as logic presupposes distinction even in its laws. The law of non-contradiction is one of these laws, and one cannot argue against it because in order to argue at all, you must presuppose it, so you cannot argue against it without assuming it. Now, one may say that if they assume the law of non-contradiction in their argument against it, then that makes their argument correct because they are assuming the law. Now, this would be admitting that the law is valid, and it would once again be a contradiction. However, this is not the case because the nature of your argument does not allow you to affirm the law, so your argument is false through demonstration. And the reason it doesn't allow you to affirm the law is because your argument is saying that the law does not exist. So, that's an issue. Now, they would also say, that it makes their argument correct because they're assuming this law. However, because of, once again, the nature of that, your argument doesn't allow for you to accept the law. You also can't say that Just because you assume a law, it doesn't necessarily mean that your argument is correct. As I can assume the law of non-contradiction in my argument, and it can be coherent to some extent. It can follow the law of non-contradiction, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my argument is correct. So just because your argument doesn't contradict itself, still doesn't mean that your argument is valid. Now, in this case, their argument does contradict themselves, so it's invalid regardless. So, 8. Therefore, because monism does not allow for distinction, it thus follows that arguments cannot be made, and that arguments cannot use the laws of logic, which also presuppose distinction from each other in virtue of being laws and not one law at the very least. Since this is the case, monism cannot be argued for logically, and therefore not argued for at all. Monism is not just lacking a sufficient argument, it is also anti-logical in itself, as logic cannot exist, because in order for logic to exist, you need distinction. In order for anything to exist, you need distinction. So, that's the first, more presuppositional critique of monism. Monism, in conclusion, just to wrap it up here, monism does not allow for argumentation. We cannot accept things without argumentation, therefore there is no reason to accept monism. Yeah, so that's basically, and a lot of people will say, well, you're just, here you're arguing that the laws of logic and that arguments are real existing things, and you're conflating metaphysics with epistemology. But, well, the whole purpose of me explaining previously how they're related is so you can understand that, well, if logic doesn't exist, and I mean the laws of logic, which must exist independent of, or maybe even if they don't exist independent of human subjects and subjectivity is all that exists, nonetheless, they still must exist as a metaphysical, or rather just an ontology, for us to be able to make arguments. So if that doesn't exist, then you can't make arguments, and you can't have knowledge. Now, you might say, okay, well, we can't have knowledge, but the problem with saying we can't have knowledge is that is in itself a knowledge claim, so that doesn't work. That's a contradictory claim. Now, the second argument against monism, or what I would call like an argument from being. Now, this is the one I kind of came to my own conclusion to. I'm not as confident in this argument as I am in the previous one. However, I do think it works. So, 1, being is that which exists, and independent of whether or not we know of a certain being, all beings have predicates or attributes to them. Predicates, things we can say about them; attributes, things that are proper to them. If beings do not have any predicates or attributes, one cannot say anything of them, as what it is to quote-unquote be is to have attributes and predicates. If a being, this is 3, if a being does not have attributes or predicates, it is not a being at all. 4, what quote-unquote nothing means is simply a lack of predicates or attributes, or total lack in that case. 5, being as such is understood to be being which is present in distinct objects, but also underlies or transcends all objects. It is not limited to a particular one object, but rather all objects. So, yeah, basically it's the underlying, it's almost hard to define. You can't, what are you going to say, force? Okay, but it's the underlying precondition for all distinct objects. They all must have being in order to be objects at all. 6, if monism is the case, not only does being as such transcend all objects. Now, note here that it would do this if monism was false as well, because being is still unified, even in non-monistic systems. But the objects which are being transcended or underlie do not actually have real substantial existence. They are illusory ontologies, because remember, once again, the objects in a monistic system are not real, they're illusions. So, 7, therefore, being, by being I mean reality, in a monistic metaphysic would be a bare and simple unity with no predication or attribute because of its lack of fulfilling its role as a precondition for distinct objects. Now, this is key to understanding, and I also want to add a note here. One may say that unity is an attribute, therefore it works. But the issue here is that this would be circular, as yes, we understand you believe in bare unity. However, I'm asking, how can this exist? And simply appealing to bare unity or saying, oh, well, it's just bare unity, it's circular. It doesn't tell me anything. So yes, unity is an attribute, but I'm asking you, how can this attribute even exist as any precondition presupposes what it is not, and thus distinction. For example, unity presupposes that it is not multiplicity. Well, okay, so now this introduces distinction. So anytime you posit an ontology or an attribute or a predicate, you are also affirming what it is not. So when I say, this cat exists, well, I'm affirming that the cat exists, and I'm not affirming that it doesn't exist, because that would be a contradiction. So now we have a binary here. The cat exists, and I'm also saying that the cat, because the cat has existence, it must exist. Well, no, not that it must exist, but that it must not exist. In the sense that it must not exist. Okay, that's more clear. I hope that comes across clear. Anytime you posit an ontology, you are positing the fact that you're positing what it is and what it is not, is basically what I'm saying. Now 8, but if something has no predicates or attributes, how can we speak of it at all? So once again, refer to line 1 and 2. So monistic being as such is the only fundamental being in the monistic system, right? But because it has no attributes or predicates, as this would imply distinction in being, it would follow that this being as such cannot exist without the presence of real distinct objects which it underlies as its precondition. So 10, the monistic metaphysic lacks the presence of real and distinct objects, in virtue of it being a monistic system, so its being as such can have no predicates or attributes, and that which lacks these things is that which has no being. Remember, we also just described how quote-unquote nothing is simply a total lack of attributes and predicates. So 11, since the monistic metaphysic defines itself as that which has no attributes or predicates, it therefore is saying it does not exist, as we cannot assign any attribute or predicate, i.e. to say anything about it, basically. Therefore, a monistic metaphysic of being cannot exist, as it has defined itself as essentially nothing. Now, note in the conclusion here, some may say that from this we could argue that being as such in a non-monistic system, or any system that posits an ontology of being as such, cannot exist either, as being as such cannot have any attribute here. However, this is not the case, as being as such does have an attribute, and its attribute is being the real precondition for the distinct objects which require its existence for the objects' own existence in one single reality, which by definition must be unified, since all objects occupy the same reality. Similarly, being as such requires particular beings to exist. Okay, now this is kind of harder to understand, but the reason is because without these attributes, particular beings is what I mean here, being as such would have no predicates or attributes. The particular attribute of being a precondition. So being a precondition is an attribute. So the attribute for being as such is being a precondition. I understand I'm using the word being a lot here, but I hope this is coming across clear. And I'm not using that word univocally, as you can probably tell. So, which once again is to say that it does not exist, and if being as such does not exist, nor do particular beings. However, we know that particular beings exist, so therefore being as such must exist, and these objects must truly be distinct for being as such to exist, because being as such must be a real precondition for real objects and not illusory objects. So those are the two arguments against monism, and then now I'm going to give you an argument against dualism. Now before I go into that, the reason I want to make an argument against dualism, because inevitably what's going to happen is people will say, okay, well, you're not a monist, so you must be a dualist. Well, no, I reject that as well. That's a problem. I don't think we are stuck in between dualism and monism. Maybe you can say, okay, you're a dualist in the sense that you believe in both unity and simplicity, and you believe that they're both symbiotic. Okay, well, maybe in that sense you can kind of say I'm a dualist, but I think that multiplicity doesn't allow for dualism in the strict sense. So once again, dualism is defined as a metaphysical claim that being is fundamentally divided into two distinct ontologies. These ontologies can vary, and that these two are typically symbiotic in terms of logical necessity or metaphysical relation. So, 1. If dualism is true, reality is fundamentally two things. Okay, this is true by definition of what dualism is. 2. If reality is fundamentally two distinct things, but both share equal existence, then something must unify these two distinct things. 3. If something unifies these two distinct things, then dualism is false, as a third ontology is that which unifies them both. If one wants to argue that it is not a third distinct thing which unifies both ontologies, but rather something inherent in both, then one admits that reality is unified regardless. 5. If one admits reality is unified, he is left with metaphysical option A or B. A is that reality is unified and brought together, and therefore dualism is false, because that which unites them is more powerful than them, as it is having an effect on both ontologies. So on both the two distinct ontologies, there's another ontology that's uniting them, and because it's having a metaphysical effect on them, it is in some sense metaphysically more potent or more powerful than them. And the second option, B, is that reality is unified and the tension between the two fundamental ontologies of reality are illusory, and these distinctions do not exist, and therefore reality is purely monistic. So this is how we see dualism easily turns into monism, as one quickly realizes that reality can't be disunited, as ontologies share the same reality. So 6, monism has been demonstrated to be false. Therefore, option B is also false, because option B is affirming monism. So 7, option A is true, and reality is both one and many in a symbiotic manner. Now, once again, we might be saying, okay, well, this is just, you just said you're a dualist and then rejected dualism because you just affirmed that reality is both one and many in a symbiotic manner. However, I think what would distinguish me from a dualist here is that I don't think that one and many is the one and the many are the fundamental ontologies. I think that you could explain reality in more fundamental ways. I think you can explain them in multiple ways which are fundamental. So, and I think that the distinctions that we see within being, obviously there are more than just two distinctions within being. I think those distinctions also matter just as much. So I think one and multiplicity, sure, that those are two things, but within multiplicity there is a indefinite amount of other distinctions. So it's not really dualism because of these other distinctions within the second category of multiplicity. So I hope that's clear. That's basically my argument. Once again, feel free to critique it, give me your feedback, and yeah, that's going to pretty much wrap it up.